So for those of you that don't know, Mark holds the position of Andreas Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University, and is a physicist working in a theological environment. He thinks of himself as a theologian of science and is interested in the complex ways that the natural sciences and religious beliefs relate to each other. His research interests include the relationship between the physical sciences and theology, and the impact of science on modern views of the Bible, especially in thinking on miracles, divine action, and the environmental crisis. And he's currently working on a critical study of the theological reception of quantum mechanics. Many of you will know Mark from his time with SRF as conference secretary and most recently as chair. And he's also the director of the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion. And he serves as president of the European Society for the Study of Science and Theology. So we are really grateful that you're here with us, Mark, and that you are able to kick us off. So I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Finn, and thank you everyone for coming along to this. This has been a really useful opportunity, actually, to start thinking myself about Arthur Peacocke's thought as, I mean, of course, he was one of the most illustrious directors of the Ian Ramsey Centre, of which I'm now director. And when I moved into this office, which you see behind me, just back in October, I took possession of a whole bunch of dusty boxes and box files. I said, oh, there's a lot of papers in your office, which you can throw them out if you like, I was told. Anyway, I started looking through them and came across gold, really, because as well as actually John Brooke, who's here, some of his notes from the past, I came across a lot of Arthur's material from the early years of the Ian Ramsey Centre back in the 1980s when Arthur was director. So I certainly won't be chucking that stuff away, particularly because a lot of it concerns the Science and Religion Forum. I found a lot of lost material that we didn't know we had. It's all in my office. So there you go. If anyone is interested in becoming an historian of Arthur Peacocke and an historian of SRF, I have the gold mine here, so please get in touch. But actually, this opportunity to talk about Arthur's theology, his emergent theology, has been very useful for me, I think, to get to grips with something, an issue that has long troubled me as a physicist, particularly who works or has worked anyway, not so much these days, has worked in condensed matter physics. I'll explain what that is if you're not quite sure as we go along. But the question I have about condensed matter physics and the science and religion world is something that may well trouble many of you who also have scientific training in areas like, I don't know, might be chemistry, material science, various of the life sciences, which are not necessarily talked about much in the science and religion world, but clearly are fully legitimate and very active sciences. And you may be wondering to yourself, why is it that science and religion scholars and theologians aren't really interested in my science? Well, this was something that has bothered me for a long time as a condensed matter physicist, but getting to grips with Arthur's thought has helped me to begin to find an answer to this. And particularly for me, working alongside and in theology these days, that really means my attempts to try to develop a theology of condensed matter physics. So this will come across as quite a technical paper because it's a very experimental area, which I'm really only just beginning to think about. So I'd appreciate any comments, suggestions, critiques that anyone has as I slowly try to draw this big mass of ideas together. But certainly Arthur's thought has been really helpful for me in this. Well, just a little bit more about condensed matter physics and why I think it's worth developing a theology. I guess in terms of scientific practice, in the physics world, it's far and away the largest discipline or sub-discipline within physics in terms of numbers of researchers, although maybe not in terms of research funding. But most importantly for all of us, condensed matter physics deals with the physics of the middle size, if you like, the kind of human-sized things, not just submicroscopic particles or on at the very far end of the length scale of galaxies. Condensed matter physics deals with the middle size, which is, of course, where the most interesting theological things happen for us as human beings. So it's quite a relevant science, I would have thought, and I want to make a case for it in this talk. Now, let me show you this very useful diagram. If I can, let's see, can I take control of my slides? There, got it, right. My next slide. This is something you may well have seen before, a diagram that is very useful, particularly for thinking about the role of cosmology and the scale of the universe. It's a very ancient symbol called the cosmic Ouroboros, this idea of a snake swallowing its own tail. Now, what you'll see is, effectively, this is an attempt to try to capture all of the length scales in the universe, or creation, we might say, if we were thinking theologically. So we have length scales up to 10 to the 30 or so centimeters. The whole the universe, insofar as we have any idea how big the universe is, going all the way down through down to the 1 centimeter length scale at the bottom, where there are human beings and an insect down there, and coming right back round full circle to 10 to the minus 25 centimeters. Now, the idea of the snake swallowing its tail, this is the point that physics at certain length scales, namely the very tiniest and the very biggest, take on a degree of similarity. Now, we don't know why that is, except that it's something to do with the physics of the Big Bang, the very, very earliest few moments of physical existence, if you like. The earliest universe has an appealing level of similarity to what we see at the subatomic level. And the physics, we suspect, is probably all bound up together. Or, well, we suspect it because we don't know how to combine quantum mechanics with gravity at the moment, but hopefully that will be something that is solved before too long. Well, at some point anyway. This is why the snake is swallowing its tail, because we believe that the physics of the smallest and the physics of the biggest are somehow very closely related. But there's all of this amazing activity of physics that goes on in between. And I particularly want to draw your attention to the middle-sized, in other words, the bit down towards the bottom between, say, 10 to the minus 10 centimeters, where you've got the atomic length scale, all the way up through DNA, that looks like some kind of cell or bacterium, a beetle, humans, mountains, the earth, to stars. This is the kind of length scale that I'm interested in as a condensed matter physicist. Why is it that the science and religion field has had so little to say about the physics of this middle-sized scale, which is exactly the regime of condensed matter physics? In any case, I think it's difficult for us to build up a theology of science, which is one of my abiding research interests, if we're only looking at some of the length scales of the universe, some of the sciences, some of the natural sciences. Well, there is probably one good reason why condensed matter physics doesn't get a great deal of attention from theologians, and I suspect that's to do with its perceived lack of fundamentality in physics as compared with particle physics and cosmology. And in fact, condensed matter physics has, for a long time, had something of an image problem there compared with these other branches of physics. And I'll say a bit more about that later on, but just to note for now that condensed matter physics is often accused of being derivative, non-fundamental, perhaps really just applied physics compared to those other branches of physics. Well, preparing this talk has given me an opportunity to think through some of the pushbacks here, some of the defense arguments I could use in favor of saying that condensed matter physics has its own fundamental questions to ask, particularly for us as middle-sized beings. But I suppose what I've come towards through preparing this talk is the belief, which I had as a sort of a hunch beforehand, I suppose. It's becoming firmer now, the belief that condensed matter physics is at the heart of a scientific description of middle-sized things, and as such does have important things to say to theologians. And it's Arthur Peacocke who has helped me to see that, I think, as a theologian who also had interests in middle-sized science, although as far as I'm aware, he didn't say anything explicit about condensed matter physics. But I'll use him to sketch out some thoughts about the possible relevance of condensed matter physics for science and religion. So let me go into my summary. This is what I plan to say. I'll spend quite a lot of time talking about Arthur and his work, particularly the relationship between science and theology, his layered view of creation and the sciences, and how this is all bound together, his layered view, with his picture of divine action. I'll say a little bit about his panentheistic views as well, before taking all this into the implications for a theology of condensed matter physics, questions of fundamentality, and I'll particularly raise this issue of what's called broken symmetry. Don't worry if this sounds completely opaque to you at the moment. Hopefully you'll understand a bit better by the end. And right in the last few minutes, I'll use what I've learned from Arthur to explore very quickly some implications for theology of condensed matter physics. Okay, so here he is. It's fair to say that Arthur is one of the big three founding figures of science and religion, one of our patriarchs, if you like, together with Ian Barber and John Polkinghorne. I mean, it's fair to say that these three people have done more than anyone else to define what you might describe as the classical field of science and religion, by which I mean a focus on certain key issues. So methodology would be one of them, of course, and we're all aware of the way that methodology, and particularly things like Ian Barber's 4 typologies, continue to spark debate, and we continue to talk about them, even though it's been 50 or so years since they first started being discussed. Reality, the question of what exactly is reality, the physical world as compared with the idea of ultimate reality, and how might critical realism as a view of reality help to somehow bridge the way of talking between the sciences and theology. Doctrine of creation is a very important aspect of all of these three people's thought, concepts of God as creator and how the sciences might inform that. Divine action has been an old chestnut in the science and religion field ever since the beginning. And of course, these three people played very key roles in that. Of course, they also, the three of them, had their own individual interests as well. So with John Polkinghorne, for instance, we're well aware that he made some quite important contributions to Christology, whereas Arthur had stronger interests really in evolutionary sciences, and some of his thought, particularly regarding the problem of evil in an evolutionary context, is still very important today, and it continues to inform that very active part of the science and religion dialogue. Well, I will focus today in talking about Arthur's work on his highly distinctive understanding of divine action, where he particularly he's known for his emphasis on strong emergence. Let me just say a little bit about his career first of all. So he taught biochemistry at Birmingham University, first of all, followed by Oxford. He was ordained as an Anglican priest. He became Dean of Clare College, Cambridge, throughout much of the 1970s, and then returned to Oxford in 1985 to become the director of the Ian Ramsey Centre in Science and Religion, which is my role now. There are some very important highlights from Arthur's career, in particular his publications. So he gave the Bampton Lectures in 1978, which were published as Creation in the World of Science. And then he gave the Gifford Lectures at St Andrews in 1993, and they were incorporated into his monumental kind of systematic theology, if you like, called Theology for a Scientific Age. So the first part of that was published in 1990, and then he incorporated the Gifford Lectures into the complete work in 1993. Like I said, that book is the nearest he came to a systematic theology, and it's absolutely saturated with talk of complexity and emergence. And given that in this year we are celebrating Arthur as the human being, the scientist, theologian, and the writer, I will actually use some fairly substantial quotations from this book, Theology for a Scientific Age, to let him speak for himself. And I think that's important, partly because Arthur's language is so particular, really, to the way he develops his emergent theology. Now, it does mean that this talk may well be a bit technical because there's quite a lot of text to get through, but I'll try to interpret it in my own way, and help you see what I'm seeing in Arthur. His writing is quite difficult. I have to say that, you know, it's not easy material by any means, but it's extremely rich, I found, as I've read and reread it. And of course, one can't talk about Arthur Peacocke without noting that he's also a Templeton Prize winner from 2001. Now, because of my interest in condensed matter physics, I'm particularly keen on the way that Arthur related the various sciences to each other. Of course, he was a biochemist, but he didn't see that as his only way into the sciences. And I think out of all of those big three figures in science and religion, it's Arthur who does the most to relate the sciences to each other and do so in a transparent and helpful way. And I'll use that material towards the end of my talk. But let me start the content by seeing how he understands the relationship between science and theology. Now, Peacocke has a high view of the truth value of science in conversation with theology. So theology must take urgent account of science. And here's a very concise quotation I found from a short popular level lecture that Arthur gave at the end of the 1990s. And he said, "Those of Christian and theist persuasion who take no account of the scientific picture of the world are forfeiting the future viability of their beliefs. They are digging themselves into a deeper and deeper hole, and as they go down, they'll be able to talk more and more to themselves and less to other thinking people. For in God's good time, truth must prevail." Now, this is a pretty strong statement, I'm sure you'll agree. Peacocke isn't against theological tradition per se, but he seems to say that when theology maintains pre-scientific images in the face of scientific advances, then it's science which owns the truth, not theology. Pretty strong stuff. And he goes on to suggest that theology must be ready to revise its language and its ideas, like scientific models. So theological metaphors contain fewer timeless truths than we might suppose. Theology is provisional, like science, and should learn from scientific methodology. Theology is provisional. Now, that was in a short kind of popular level lecture where Arthur was being very direct. Let's turn to his Theology for a Scientific Age and how he develops this idea of the provisionality of theology in more detail. Here's a quotation from page 15. "The metaphors of theological models that explicate religious experience," and here he's thinking about descriptions of God, "can refer to and can depict reality without at the same time being naively and unrevisably descriptive, and they share this character with scientific models of the natural world. We may reasonably hope to speak realistically of God through revisable metaphor and model." So what I take Arthur to be saying here is that God should be treated as a proposition to be tested by experience. So theologians should test their models of God in the same way that scientists test their scientific models, by assessing their fit with data, their internal coherence, their fruitfulness in suggesting other scientific or theological models. Now, that's a pretty radical proposal in theological terms. Think how many of the everyday images and descriptions that the mainstream Christian churches use of God, for instance, God as Father, God as faithful, good, eternal, omniscient, and so on and so on. Arthur's suggesting that all of these are, in principle, revisable and perhaps even worth discarding if the God that we find by experience doesn't match those labels. Just to summarize that, what I think that Arthur is suggesting is that theology is done by experience. Theology is empirical. Now, here's a remarkable quotation a little bit further on that same page. And what Arthur is doing here is experimenting with the distinction between the ways that we refer to God, by means of metaphorical titles, for instance, like God as faithful or God as a rock or something like that, and the ways that we actually try to describe God in God's self. And what he does here, he points out that there's an experimental dimension to our language, which is why he puts so much of this in scare quotes. This is what he says: God is the one who is encountered in this particular experience now or in the past, in me or in others. How, in theology, that which the one who is encountered in any particular experience is to be identified with what the tradition has named as God is by inferring to the best explanation by application of the criteria of reasonableness that are used generally to assess ideas and, in particular, in appraising scientific models and theories, namely fit with the data, internal coherence, comprehensiveness, fruitfulness, and general cogency. Now, this is a pretty tricky passage. Arthur has many passages like this, I'm afraid. He's pretty opaque in places, and you have to really read this again and again and again to try to work out what exactly he is getting at here. So I have to confess that I may have got this wrong, but I think that this is part of Arthur's very careful attempt to say that the way we describe God and the language we use to refer to God are similarly linked with scientific models and scientific descriptions by their degree of provisionality, and we have to test them the bit towards the end by means of fit with data, internal coherence, and so on and so on. So in other words, our descriptions of God, our doctrines, if you like, are like scientific theories. We need to apply some criteria of reasonableness, such as fit with the data, internal coherence, and so on. Now, how does this attitude to theology as an experimental science almost, how does that inform Arthur's view of nature and creation? Well, I will summarize a bit here rather than leading you through the quotations. It's quite simple, I think, that if both science and theology are provisional, experimental even, then they are, in a sense, different expressions of the same kinds of ultimate truth. In other words, both the sciences and theology are empirical, that is, experiential, accounts of God's creation. Both the sciences and theology are empirical accounts of God's creation. Now, to give a well-known example of what Arthur is suggesting here, or what I'm reading Arthur as saying, you may well know that he makes a very strong connection between evolution and God's presence in the world. And he suggests that if you want to see where God is working in nature, well, look at what the biologists are doing. Look at what biological sciences are uncovering. There, that's theology. The creator works through evolution. God is the creator who is continually bringing into existence that which is new, that which is novel in solving the problems of natural selection. Science reveals God's work. God's work establishes science. Okay, so very, very close link there between science and theology. Let's turn to how he sees creation in conceptual terms. And here we have to do with how the various sciences relate to each other. And that's really important in Peacocke. And this is one of the reasons why I find his thoughts so useful for my own view of condensed matter physics. Now, Arthur thinks of the arena of God's work, creation, as layered. And this is what he calls his hierarchies of complexity. You'll see that in the title on this slide. It's a reasonably familiar kind of idea if you're a reductionist or an emergentist for that matter, but Arthur has his own take on it, and I'll show you some diagrams in a minute. The point here is that the various academic disciplines, sciences and humanities, cover a wide spectrum of scales covering the natural and human worlds, from the microscopic to the cosmic. And Arthur uses the human person as a way of expressing these different layers symbolically, because he explains how the human person embraces the whole spectrum. And there's this great quote from page 218 of Theology for a Scientific Age on the screen. He says, "A human being may now be said to be a microcosm of the macrocosm." So every level in his hierarchy of complexities is a whole that must be dealt with on its own terms, but it relates to those above and below by means of emergence. And there's this quotation I'm going to read out now from page 22. "We have no basis for any favored attribution of reality to the different levels in the hierarchy of complexity. Knowledge of each level, or perhaps better, along each vector of inquiry, has to be regarded as a kind of slice through the totality of reality." So each level in this hierarchy is a slice through the totality. So Peacocke's layers don't work spatially then, and this is why I'm hesitating to give you a diagram, because I'm not sure the diagram really helps, but the layers don't work spatially, you know, with littlest things, fundamental particles at the bottom, and then the biggest things, the universe at the top. His layers are structured in terms of how the human person emerges from the sciences and the humanities. And this is my attempt at, well, it's not really a diagram, but it's my attempt at labeling four of his labels in four terms anyway. So remember, the human being is a microcosm of the macrocosm, the cosmos. So level one at the bottom, the physical basis of the human being. So we would talk about physics, particularly, you know, particle physics, obviously. He doesn't mention condensed matter physics, but presumably it's in there. Chemistry, geology, and cosmology. Level two, human beings as living organisms. So we have the life sciences and neuroscience in here. Level three, the sciences of human behavior, psychology, cognitive science, sociology. And then level four, human culture, arts, humanities, science as a cultural phenomenon. Now, I've simplified massively here. I will show you his complete scheme that's in his book. If you can read it, it's fairly detailed, but the point I want to make here, you can see that there are four levels here. The point I want to make is that by using the analogy of the human person and binding it all together as the arena of divine action, what Arthur does is to construct a layered but still holistic view of the sciences and the humanities. Now, you might be wondering where theology appears in this scheme. It's noticeable that you can't find theology here anywhere, although religion does appear in level 4. I suspect that Arthur imagines everything to be theology, because God's action on the world relates to every level alike. Well, we might ask, if this scheme represents the world, where is the point of contact between God and the world? So the natural, supernatural boundary, if you like, what's often referred to as the causal joint. Well, in common with most other science and religion scholars, Arthur is committed to non-interventionism. So he sees God's work as taking place alongside, in tandem with natural causal processes. This is not an interventionist view where God just suddenly erupts into the world and throws all the laws of nature aside. If you want to see where and how God is at work in the scheme of life, of course, he clearly says, look at the biological sciences. But I suspect he would be quite happy with saying also look at material science and earth science and every other science as well. One question that arises, though, is does God work on one level in particular, such as the base level, as in the case of the well-known quantum mechanical model of divine action? Or perhaps does God work really mostly in the life sciences in levels 2 or 3? Well, actually, I read Arthur as suggesting that God works on all levels simultaneously. So he says that he has a strong emphasis on top-down action, strong emergence. But he doesn't think of this as an action right at the top of the layers, which then percolates down to the bottom diachronically. Instead, God works on the whole of reality at once, synchronically, by being the boundary condition of the whole world. And this is quite a subtle issue, which I'm going to try to tease out over the next 5 minutes or so. It takes a bit of explaining, but let me begin by pointing out that Arthur uses a whole proliferation of terms to try to capture his entire scheme of the world as the arena of God's work, the world and every level simultaneously. So he uses terms like system as a whole, or the total world system, or the world as a whole, or system of systems. These appear very prominently in his writing on divine action. And he sees this, well, I'll use system as a whole as one term. It's a constraint which influences every other layer. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read a really quite a long passage, but I think, at least I feel, this is the key passage in Arthur's Theology for a Scientific Age, for trying to understand this emergent theology that he's developing, this idea of the world as a whole, system of systems, and how God's divine action binds it all together. So please forgive me for this very long quotation. Hopefully it will make some sense, and I will try to interpret it. So it goes over several slides. In the light of these features of the natural world, and he's particularly been talking about complexity and emergence, might we not properly regard the world as a whole as a total system, so that its general state can be a top-down, in scare quotes, notice that, causative factor in, or constraint upon, what goes on at the myriad levels that comprise it? I suggest that these new perceptions of the way in which causality actually operates in our hierarchically complex world provide a new resource for thinking about how God could interact with that world. For it points to a way in which we could think of divine action making a difference in the world, yet not in any way contrary to those regularities and laws operative within the observed universe, which are explicated by the sciences applicable to the level of complexity and organization in question. And what he's saying here, basically, is that divine action makes a difference to the world, but not in such a way that the sciences would notice it. So he's being a non-interventionist here. And he goes on to say, it also provides this view of science of complexity and emergence. It also provides an appropriate and helpful model of how natural events, including the unpredictable ones and the outcome of freely willed human decisions, could work their way up through the hierarchy of systems and contribute to the state of the whole. It therefore helps us to model more convincingly that interaction, dialogue even, between human decisions and actions on the one hand, and divine intentions and purposes on the other. It's in such a context that the significance of prayer, worship, and the sacraments are rooted. Attempts to hold together the notions of God's transcendence over the world, his ultimate otherness, with that of his immanent presence in, with, and under the world, often find it helpful to deploy models of the world as being in some sense in God, but of God as being more than the world, and so as the circumambient reality in which the world persists and exists, and entheism. Phew. Okay, right. There is an awful lot in that passage that I just read out. I think it contains more or less the entirety of Arthur's view of the God-world relationship and of how divine action works, but you've got to do a lot of unpacking to get at it. Notice that he is a committed panentheist anyway. The world is in God. Every level of reality is in God. Every natural process, even as it works its way up or down the hierarchy of layers, exists in God, who exercises a constraint on the whole, contains it. So Peacocke explains God's action as though it appears top down to us, while human decisions work their way up through the hierarchy of complexity towards the top. So you can almost imagine that our prayers wing their way up through the layers, while action from God appears to flutter down the layers like a dove. And it's tempting almost to think of Peacocke's layers as constantly shimmering with activity in all directions, both vertically and horizontally, actually. But note, actually, that the direction of God's action is more subtle than that. It's not as though our prayers go up and God's action comes down. Of course, he uses the top-down language for God's work, but it's not as though there's a chain of causes fluttering down through the hierarchy. God's action is more precisely through God being the boundary to the world. And I'm going to give you one last rather complicated quotation from him. On this model, it's just a little bit further on from that passage I read to you. On this model of God's relation to the world as a whole, the total world system is seen as in God, remember panentheism, who uniquely is present to it as a whole, as well as to its individual component entities. If God interacts with the world at this supervenient level of totality, then he could be causatively effective in a top-down manner. In other words, God looks as though his action is top-down, without abrogating the laws and regularities and the unpredictability you noted that operate at the myriad sub-levels of existence that constitute that world. Particular events could occur in the world and be what they are because God intends them to be so without at any point any contravention of the laws of physics, biology, psychology, sociology, or whatever is the pertinent science for the level of description in question. So the way I read Arthur here is that God is the constraint on all natural causes, which makes God the limiting factor on every natural cause in the universe. God is the metaphorical boundary for every law of nature, if you like. So it might look to us as though the divine causes are trickling down from the top to the bottom, but that's just a metaphor. God is the limit on every cause at every level, or as he says himself elsewhere in another book, gives a very pithy summary of his idea. God is the ultimate boundary condition of all that is. And a related term that he uses is to speak of God as the whole part constraint on all causal processes in the world. It's not as though we could look at some causes and say, well, that one's natural and that one's divine. Rather, the whole world is a system of systems. God is the whole constraint on all the parts. They're all integrated into a whole. Okay, so I've given you a lot of texts from Arthur to try to illustrate how he puts his scheme of divine action together. But I think I've got some pictures here which might help us to understand what he's got in mind here. Some alternative analogies for thinking about God's divine action. So God's action is like plate tectonics is to an individual volcanic eruption, or God's action is like the evolutionary tree of life to the life of a single organism. Or God is like the statistical mechanics description of a gas, where the behavior of individual gas molecules appears random, but statistically, seen as a whole, they are macroscopic quantity. There are macroscopic quantities that can be measured, such as temperature or pressure. So I think that these sorts of analogies might help us to understand the way that Arthur is envisaging top-down action here. Now, there are various critical questions that can be raised about how successful is this scheme of his, and how well does it work, and how well does it relate to other schemes of divine action that we might know about, such as the quantum mechanical one. I won't go into those. Simply, I will note that I particularly value the way that Arthur makes use of all of the sciences and the humanities. He doesn't privilege any one of them as being more divine than others, in effect. And he takes complexity, emergence, and the diversity of the modern scientific landscape very, very seriously, which I, as a condensed matter physicist, particularly value. So I'm going to go on now to talk a bit about the implications for a theology of condensed matter physics. First of all, what is this thing that I keep talking about, condensed matter physics? I'm often asked this question, actually. It doesn't seem to be obvious what this thing is in a way that, say, particle physics or cosmology is. Well, I usually say the clue is not in the name. So for sure, condensed matter physics is the physics of condensed matter. That is, solids and liquids, matter which isn't in a gaseous or plasma form. But the point here is that it's the interactions between the atoms and molecules that have taken over in condensed matter physics. The constituent particles are now highly dependent on each other and on the whole, and we find completely new kinds of physics, properties, structures, and dynamics emerging, compared with if you look at the individual parts. And for that reason, condensed matter physics is sometimes referred to as many-body physics, because it really is the many is the important point here. Now, as you're probably aware, there are many technological benefits from physics at this kind of length scale or length scales. We probably all have examples of something that benefits directly from condensed matter physics. I'm holding one here. Also, condensed matter physics has a great deal of overlap with other sciences such as chemistry, mineralogy, biophysics, material science, engineering, and it values interdisciplinarity very highly, because all of these sciences have a very strong interest in middle-sized things. In other words, you could almost say that condensed matter physics is a microcosm of the scientific landscape in its own way. And as such, it addresses questions about really everyday observations at our level, such as, for instance, why is iron magnetic? But why is stainless steel not magnetic, for instance, if it's largely made up of iron? Why does graphite conduct electricity, but diamond doesn't, if they're both forms of carbon? What is glass? Is it a solid, or is it a very viscous liquid that stopped flowing? Well, there are endless questions like this, all of which concern matter and phenomena on our human length scale. But a question that always arises about the status of condensed matter physics is it just a random selection of kind of middle-sized problems, which will just reduce to the problems of particle physics eventually if we understood particle physics in full? In fact, could we reduce condensed matter physics to particle physics in principle? Well, not now. We don't know how to do that. Our computers aren't powerful enough. Perhaps sometime in the future, when our theories and calculations are more powerful, is it possible that actually condensed matter physics is really just particle physics on a large scale? Or even, as some particle physicists say, they call condensed matter physics, well, it's just dirty physics, isn't it? I've heard that said. Does condensed matter physics truly concern fundamentals in science, or is it really just dirty physics? Well, as you might expect, we condensed matter people actually do think our research is fundamental. We are, all of us, in some shape or form, emergentists. Some of us are really full-blooded, strong emergentists, but all of us are committed to some form of weak emergence at the very least. And our conviction is that even if it turns out that particle physics might one day be able to calculate all of the properties of condensed matter from first principles, well, even if it could do that, the human race would be deeply impoverished in intellectual terms. And the reason I say that is because condensed matter physics provides beautiful, intuitive explanations in its own right by working on the higher levels. And we have a fantastic example of that, which is called the BCS model of superconductivity, which is like superfluidity in liquid helium. This is a macroscopic, in other words, a middle-sized quantum effect. And the model here of superconductivity is caused by electrons pairing up as they surf on sound waves in a crystal lattice and then flowing with zero resistance. This gives us a fantastically intuitive picture of what's going on. And it's inconceivable that you could get that same heuristic picture, that intuition, by doing some gigantic calculation from the bottom level up, from the quarks and the gluons. All that such a massive calculation would provide would be, in effect, a kind of phenomenological description of superconductivity, not an intuitive understanding that we humans could grasp on our human middle-sized level. And of course, the BCS explanation that I've just given you about electrons pairing up and surfing on the lattice is one of the most celebrated heuristic insights in 20th century physics. So I think this is something that points to the value of actually taking a middle-sized view and not saying that everything boils down to the tiniest particles. Now, it's taken quite a while for the field of condensed matter physics to develop this degree of self-confidence. And the person that we really have to thank for this picture comes from Phil Anderson, who was one of the leading condensed matter theorists and the one who's probably done the most to define and explain the discipline. His writing about condensed matter physics really took place in the context of debates with particle physicists about, what's more fundamental? Is condensed matter physics at all fundamental? He was very robustly defended the area of condensed matter and said, yes, it is fundamental. The title of his most famous paper says it all, really. It's just simply called More is Different. And I'll give you his most famous quotation, which is often repeated from that paper. He's talking about the fallacy of particle physicists in saying that everything can be reduced down to subatomic particles. He says, the main fallacy in this kind of thinking is that the reductionist hypothesis does not by any means imply a constructionist one. The ability to reduce everything to simple fundamental laws does not imply the ability to start with those laws and reconstruct the universe. In fact, the more the elementary particle physicists tell us about the nature of the fundamental laws, the less relevance they seem to have to the very real problems of the rest of science, much less to those of society. Instead, at each level of complexity, entirely new properties appear, and the understanding of the new behaviors requires research, which I think is as fundamental in its nature as any other. In other words, just because we think we can reduce all of matter down to atoms and subatomic particles, that doesn't mean that we can build the matter up again and understand it simply by joining up those quarks and gluons and electrons. And Anderson goes on to develop two fundamental principles that unify condensed matter into a single intellectual discipline. It's a very, very important piece of work here, where he realized that if he's going to say that condensed matter physics is fundamental as a discipline, it needs to have its own universal principles. These are, and I will explain these as I go along. The first is broken symmetry. And the second he variously calls adiabatic continuity or model building or renormalization. Well, this second one, adiabatic continuity, this is really an important methodological principle in condensed matter. This is really the idea where we make a simplified model of our huge system, and we assume that this will capture the important properties that we're interested in. We realize it's an approximation and that it's completely going to miss out on some of the other properties. We're not interested in those. We're going to simplify so much just to look at the key parameters. So this is really a methodological principle. It's become very widespread in physics and the physical sciences. It's what you might have heard of as called coarse graining. But what about one, broken symmetry? What is this? Well, this is very important, I think, particularly through connecting back to Arthur Peacocke, because Anderson realizes that broken symmetry is effectively another way of talking about strong emergence, but with a robust physical basis. Now, what is broken symmetry? In Anderson, it's a ubiquitous property of nature. It's the way that we explain changes of state from any physical entity into another. A classic example might be liquid H2O, water, crystallizing into solid H2O, ice. At the point of the transition where liquid crystallizes into water crystallizes into ice, there's a symmetry breaking. So the very open, if you like, symmetry of the water molecules is lost as they are bound into a crystal lattice and forced to sit in certain positions and point in certain directions. The important symmetry is broken at that point. Now, here is his, and Anderson points out that broken symmetry is absolutely ubiquitous in nature, not only in condensed matter physics, but in every scientific area you can think of. And for sure, the whole notion of broken symmetry has percolated through many of the physical sciences since he made this point, and even to the extent that we can talk about the different regimes studied by different sciences as being controlled by broken symmetry. Anyway, this is what he says in a popular level piece. It's quite a nice little reference in here to a famous story from the history of philosophy. He said that matter at sufficiently high temperatures is in the gaseous state, and at even higher temperatures, the molecules dissociate and the atoms ionize. But cold matter is a different case, as Dr. Johnson, this is Samuel Johnson, forcefully demonstrated in his famous response to Bishop Berkeley. You may know about Bishop Berkeley's idealism, effectively imposing mind as the most important form of reality. Samuel Johnson was an important critic of Berkeley's. Anderson goes on to say, when you kick a stone, no doubt remains in your mind that it possesses a property that we call rigidity, which we recognize as the very epitome of broken translational invariance. Not only does it occupy a fixed position in space, the stone, but translational symmetry is broken everywhere within it, in that the individual atoms all occupy fixed positions. So even to recognize basic changes in state in nature, such as between a gas, a liquid, and a solid, is to speak of broken symmetries, and they are absolutely ubiquitous in nature and between scientific disciplines. So Anderson is really significant in the history of emergentism in providing a specific physical means to identify emergence, which is broken symmetry, which is why Anderson calls emergence, he calls it the God principle. And this is, I'm nearly at the end of my talk, very important quotation, I think, from one of Anderson's last pieces of work called More and Different. He says, the world in which we actually live is the consequence primarily or only, not of some incredibly simple but hidden God equation or God particle, but of the God principle of emergence at every level. So taking Anderson's suggestion here that emergence is the God principle, I think we might say that God isn't so much in the laws of nature or the search for a theory of everything or an ultimate God particle, but God is in the spontaneous symmetry breakings that occur everywhere in nature, all the time. And remember Arthur Peacocke, God is everywhere at work in evolution. So so Peacocke was effectively seeing this in the biological sciences. If you want to find God in biology, look in evolution. There is God in work. Well, taking this over to Anderson, if we say to Anderson, where is God at work? Anderson would, well, Anderson was actually an atheist, but I'm being slightly playful with this thought, and I'd say that if we want to know where God is active in physical processes, look at symmetry breaking. There, that's God. No need to talk about Laplace's demon and the laws of nature constricting God. God is what is in what's spontaneous and ubiquitous, symmetry breaking. Well, let me finish with some thoughts about a theological treatment of condensed matter physics, combining Peacocke's emphasis on emergent divine action with Anderson and his thought about broken symmetry. First, the debate about the identity and the fundamentality of condensed matter physics echoes this infamous problem about the unity of science. What is it that makes the sciences science, and how do they all relate to physics and particles and so on? Well, this is a very long-standing problem in the science and religion world because it relates to how we might want to theologically describe nature as a single unitive entity, as opposed to many theologies of natures, many theologies of sciences. Well, we know that condensed matter physics is a very diverse collection of research fields, and it does reflect in many ways the way that other sciences hold together in the scientific landscape. And I've given you a diagram here of Anderson's own view of how science relates. Nothing hierarchical here, nothing layered. He has this idea of a seamless web of science. And I think this is a very valuable way of looking for the unity of science, particularly through Anderson's view of broken symmetry. So I think I would like to revise Arthur Peacocke's view of layered view of reality and start to think about Anderson's seamless web and the way that broken symmetry is a way of moving around the web from node to node, if you like. Finally, I realize that I'm definitely running out of time. Peacocke, in the way that he stressed top-down action, and I tried to explain that by using constraint. I feel that needs a bit more illumination, really, and I would like to use Anderson's thought again on broken symmetry and the way that emergence works across the seamless web to talk about diachronic and synchronic emergence. And these are things that I hope that I will be able to use to talk about divine action as well. So effectively what I'm suggesting as a kind of theology of condensed matter physics is combining Arthur Peacocke and Phil Anderson. So really this is a work in progress. These are definitely experimental thoughts towards a theology of condensed matter physics. And so I will stop there, and I would love to hear your own thoughts and comments on what I'm sure has been a rather dense and complicated talk, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Mark. I mean, you definitely tackled a lot, but I think actually you did a really good job of making it accessible to those of us that aren't physicists. So thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm not going to open with questions. We've got till 1:30 with Mark, so you've plenty of time to quiz him on the details of his experimental thoughts. If people want to stick their hands up, please go ahead and stick your hands. Oh, look, there we go. I didn't see who put their hand up first either. So if I go with Sarah, because you're first on my screen, and then Luca will come to you afterwards.
Thank you. I just wanted a clarification, because in your very last slide, you were talking about diachronic versus synchronic emergence. And could you please elaborate a little bit more on that?
Definitely. Thanks, Sarah, for that question. Yeah, this was something that I wanted to say more about, but I sort of I realized I was running out of time. So there is... So synchronic emergence is a particular problem for top-down accounts of emergence, because if you have to think very carefully about how does this work in time. So if you have a causal process that's trickling down the layers, it has to take place in time. Whereas if you say that some top-down emergent cause affects all of the layers simultaneously, that is effectively an incoherent account, because it's rather like saying that I could pull myself up by my shoelaces. So I learned this in a conference recently, which was devoted to talk of strong emergence, the idea that synchronic talk of strong emergence is generally not favored by philosophers at the moment. So we need to think in diachronic terms about, if we need to think in terms of trickling down, then it's a diachronic process. Now, Peacocke's view of divine action, like I said, it sounds as though, because he talks about top down, it's as though God's causes trickle down through the layers. But actually what Peacocke is doing, really, I think, is having God as the boundary to all of the layers, which I think is a synchronic account. Am I making sense here? The trouble is,
it would be like the phenomena, they would appear in all of the layers at the same time in the synchronic, while there is, like in the diachronic, there is some sort of mechanism that is going to put kind of the layers into communication, and the phenomena will spread over time. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah. So if you think about a phase transition from water into ice, that's a diachronic breaking of symmetry. And I think that if we are to speak of strong emergence, then it's through such ways that we need to do so, rather than, like God altering the whole universe simultaneously. Mm-hmm. That you can tell that I haven't thought this through very clearly yet.
Like from physics, it seems like all of them would need to be diachronic. So I definitely see the point that it's more favored from the.
Yeah, and I think that this is an issue about diachronic versus synchronic that, at least in the science and religion world, hasn't been explored very heavily yet. And Arthur doesn't mention it at all in his book. I suspect it hadn't even occurred in the emergentist dialogue at the time. It's something I've just become aware of in the last few weeks, really, largely from reading philosophy of science on this.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. We'll go to Luca, and then I've got a question in the chat that I'll come to.
Thank you, Mark. I really enjoyed the presentation. It's funny enough, I've reached a similar conclusion of the provisionality with science and theology, also that they both entail an apopathic and catapathic moment, because you try to discover, but then you fail. And both of them have this. I will discuss this tomorrow. But my question is, I would like that you comment if Peacocke, how Peacocke described God transcendence. And I ask this because I would like to hear whether you think that in his language, sometimes he can use an univocal language to describe God. Because, for example, when you say, when he said that God is like this boundary constraint, something like that, and then you took the example of Anderson, that affirmed that God is the principle. You said the principle of that act at every level in emergence. It seems to me that this language can be quite univocal. Not analogical, but within creation, not beyond creation. So I wonder, have you noticed in his language if he use, let's say, for example, an analogical language to speak about God, or will he just describe the phenomenon as that God must act here? But if yes, how?
Thanks, Luca. Yeah, really tricky question to tease out of Arthur Peacocke's thought here. So as you'll have realized, he was extremely careful with his language because he was aware of this very issue. We often do this in the science and religion world, I think, a little bit not careful enough about whether we're saying something analogically or directly about God. It's a constant problem. He is more careful than most here, but I think that sometimes it's not entirely clear. For instance, when Arthur talks about God as a boundary condition, does Arthur mean that God is literally a boundary condition in natural terms, or is it just another metaphor? I suspect that Arthur understands it in metaphorical terms because he puts scare quotes everywhere, but it's never entirely certain. And related to that is the question, so you asked about God's transcendence in Peacocke's thought. Related to that is the question of how does Arthur's panentheism work? Because one of the problems that can beset panentheistic views is that they can be quite similar to pantheist views of God if you're not careful. And one of the critiques that Arthur gets is, is he actually a pantheist? Or is he just a theist who feels that theism isn't quite immanent enough? I mean, it's a constant question that is often asked of panentheism. So I'm sure that he is aware of this because he goes to great lengths to discuss his panentheism. I suspect that the God is transcendent, but when you look from the perspective of traditional theism, questions always arise about, well, God as a boundary condition, does this mean God is a cause amongst causes, or is it just a metaphor? So I must admit that I'm not wholly certain on this myself, partly because Peacocke's language is so complex, and I'm still working my way through his thought. But I acknowledge that it's an open question, so I'm not sure I can quite answer you clearly there. If anyone else has any more intimate knowledge of Arthur's thought, I would love to hear it.
Well, whilst we let them think, Mark, I've got a very simple question that you've got a whole 15 minutes to answer. How does one explain miracles in religion, given a non-interventionist view of God? Off you go.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that does require at least 15 minutes. So I could go through the history of miracles here. Of course, in the modern world, our go-to definition is the one provided by David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, where miracles are seen to be a violation or a transgression of a law of nature by God or an invisible agent. I suppose that means an angel or a demon. So a transgression of a law of nature, which has given us in modern times this very strong sense that there's a kind of a solid boundary between nature and supernature, and God can only work in the world by breaking through it. That's a relatively modern belief. I don't think that people through the history of human thought have adhered to that, except for the last couple hundred years or so. It has colored our view of miracles, and the science and religion world has, various writings on miracles have taken place, have been published over the last few decades, but there has been a lot of thought about special divine action in the science and religion world, largely without treading too closely to what exactly is a miracle, though. So Peacocke's thought on divine action that I've just been talking about does not, he's quite explicit about this. He doesn't want to talk about miracles. It's almost as though a miracle is a separate category of divine action from everything I've just been talking about. So, of course, the question then arises, well, what's the difference between God, working on the entire universe to answer someone's prayer to a miracle? Well, then you get into questions of definition. But Arthur, and like many other science and religion scholars, doesn't appear to want to get too much into that question of semantics and definition of what's one kind of divine action against another. But later on in his Theology for a Scientific Age, he does have some discussion of the kind of classic miracle stories of Christ, such as the resurrection. And Arthur is famously, skeptical is probably too strong a word, but he doesn't believe in the full bodily resurrection of Jesus. And again, he's quite careful with his language here, but he's not a kind of a classic traditional bodily resurrectionist, if you like. So he does have quite a subtle understanding of miracles, but unfortunately, he didn't really put down clearly exactly what he thought about them. So what exactly is a miracle? How do we draw all this together? For myself, one of the great limitations of this question of what is a miracle is that the main scriptural accounts that Christians have to go with never use the term miracle. So we might talk about, the miracle of the Red Sea crossing, for instance, or Jesus healing miracles. Fine, except for the fact that the texts themselves never use that word, and they never use a single term to describe these events. So we're already, by calling them miracles, performing some kind of interpretative action in drawing them all together into the same kind of thing. So straight away that introduces some questions, but it means, we're already interpreting these things, these stories. If you look at what the terminology is used in the texts, particularly in the Hebrew Bible, you have a collection of different terms like great deed or deed of wonder, deed of power, things like that, or sign, all of which tend to refer to the point that whatever is going on in nature, it has an impact on those who see it or those who hear about it. In other words, it's not an objective event that happens completely in a vacuum. it's rather like the question of, if a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? So you could say, well, if a miracle happens and there's no one there to see it, is it a miracle? Probably not. So all these questions about the kind of subjective elements of miracles and the impact on those who view them or witness them come into the discussion about what exactly is a miracle. And you end up batting backwards and forwards between an objective definition, like it's a transgression of the law of nature, and a subjective definition, which is it's what a believer in miracles thinks is a miracle. So, and there are very, very different attempts to try to balance those two. But essentially, you've got some kind of spectrum of definitions, all of which, as I said, are hindered by the fact that our basic scriptural accounts don't use the terminology to begin with. So it's a fantastically complicated area, and I've got a book that I've been meaning to write. I've been trying to write on this for about 10 years now, and I keep getting stuck because of all these questions. Basically, my thought hasn't boiled down to a simple answer yet. But yeah, I'd probably better stop because I'd love to hear what other people think on this.
Thanks, Mark. Paul, you've got your hand up. So if you've got, something equally simple for Mark to tackle in the last 3 minutes, then go for it. You're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Good. It's related, actually. As somebody who's a scientist and then theologian, and then in a very practical way, 30 years of ministry. An example would be a teenager who died of asthma. And as the minister looking after the family and taking the service, and the family asked me, why has God done this? And this is practical theology. I suppose what I'm really saying is that theology is also subjective, and importantly so. Now, I didn't give them an answer, a sort of analytical answer. What I actually said was, I believe God is crying with you, which I did believe, but I'm being subjective then, and probably I'm trying to defend theology in a sense, in that it is also quite properly subjective, not just objective. I mean, miracle means something we marvel at, doesn't it? So that's a reaction. But the question here really is, if we say God determines the boundaries, then are we being completely deterministic? We're being Calvinist, perhaps. The answer would be, well, God intended that teenager to die, because otherwise the boundaries will be in a different place. So is it predestination we're talking about? And within the middle of this is randomness as well. But so am I making sense?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Thanks, Paul. No, that's great. Thank you for raising this eternal problem, which always lies in the background for any discussion about divine action or miracle, namely, why might we believe God does this but not that? Why might God answer one person's prayers and not another? The problem of evil has been discussed. It's been a problem for thousands of years, long before quantum mechanics or Arthur Peacocke and his talk about whole part constraint and so on. It always runs in the background of this entire field. And of course, for some scholars, it is such a significant issue that we shouldn't even be talking about divine action in such ways, because it's almost as though we're forgetting about the problem of evil and the importance of the sufferer. It's worth pointing out, because I didn't point it out, that Arthur is also amongst the big three science and religion founders, if you like. Of those three, I think he's the one who was most affected by that question, the problem of evil, and said the most helpful things, I think. And his thought on that problem of evil still stands today. He particularly wrote some great stuff in a volume called The Work of Love, which was edited by John Polkinghorne, all about the problem of evolutionary suffering. So he certainly, I think, would be sympathetic to the answer that you gave there, Paul. And Arthur would certainly have wanted to bring this problem to the front of the conversation, which I didn't do at all in my talk. So I should confess my own lack of mentioning that problem myself.
It may be that I remember talking to Phil Luscombe and him complaining that my science was messy, and I said, well, it's got people in it.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, and so the biological sciences tend to do that more. It's something you do. My own research was air pollution, and that involved all sorts of questions like that.
Yeah. No, thank you for that very useful reminder of what the other big problem that stands behind all of this.
John, go for it. You're on mute at the moment, John.
John, you're on mute.
Is that better?
Yeah.
Fine. Well, I do want to say, Mark, I found that a very helpful and very clear exposition of Arthur's thinking as I became aware of it, particularly because my years in Oxford were exactly contemporary with the closing years of his time as director of the Ian Ramsey Centre. It's just that question of the provisionality of theology, similarly perhaps with provisionality in the sciences. And just to say that it is interesting to reflect that made him a very controversial figure among the theologians whom I encountered in Oxford, and particularly, I have to say, theology undergraduates, because one often heard remarks they made, sadly in one case I remember, about the wretched Peacocke. And I think this is precisely because Arthur's whole view of theology was not consistent with how people felt there was a defense to be made of theological dogma of various kinds. So I thought, and forgive me, it doesn't help very much, but I do think we should remember the context in which he was actually working.
Thank you, John. That's fascinating. How interesting. So I only met Arthur once, unfortunately. I was aware of him, of course, because I was in Oxford myself during some of this time. But I hadn't realized until I started studying his work in more depth in the last couple of months, really how remarkable his view of theology was and how unusual it was. He's not remembered as such now, at least not by those of us who talk about Peacocke in classes or so. But I learned a lot through actually reading Peacocke himself on this, and I'm glad that you've confirmed my sense of, gosh, this is strong stuff. Yeah, no, thank you.
Thanks, John. Does anyone have any other final questions for Mark?
Just a brief following what was just said now. So did Arthur Peacocke said that this kind of idea of the provisionality of science and theology, did it imply also that the dogma are not yet consolidated? There is an evolution of the doctrine, or did he say something like that?
Well, yes, if you go back, I could go back in my slides. I don't think he talked about an evolution of dogma so much as just he made theology out to be very similar to science in the way that we infer theological doctrines in a very similar way to scientific models. Theological doctrines are provisional, just as are scientific models, and we use criteria such as criteria of reasonableness by which he means fit with the data, which would be our everyday experience, as well as scripture, internal coherence, comprehensiveness, and so on and so on. So he sees theological doctrine as being, really very similar to scientific models, and also derived empirically by our experience. So he had a more so than other scientist theologians saw theology as an empirical discipline in a way.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. We'll give you all a virtual round of applause. Really, really appreciate it. And thanks for kicking it off. I think it was so great to have it so tied into Arthur's work, but also just absolutely fascinating. And I think, you know, you did a phenomenal job of, you know, really kind of breaking it down in a way that was understandable and sent us all the way. I definitely am going to be listening to the recording when it comes back out and kind of thinking it over some more. So thank you very much.